King Philip II bashed open the doors to his son's bedchamber himself. He came not as a father, but as a general leading an invasion, clad from head to toe in battle armor. The clash of steel echoed as the heavy doors flew wide. Guards surged into the room behind the king, their torches painting the chamber in an orange glow. What they found was not an enemy army, but a young man, Prince Don Carlos of Spain, thrashing wildly in his bed. His hair was matted, his eyes sunken, his body wasted. This was no ordinary prince. This was the heir to the most powerful empire in the world, yet also its greatest liability. Philip's heart twisted as he entered. This was his son, his blood, the boy who should one day inherit Spain, the Netherlands, and the New World. Yet here he was, consumed by madness, his body broken by nature itself. The king's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. He came not with paternal love, but with grim resolve. Tonight, he would arrest his own son. But how did Spain's golden empire produce such a doomed heir? To understand, we must step back 2 decades, to the cursed birth of Don Carlos. Before we sink into these buried stories, these tales of dysfunction, trauma, and royal delusion, pause for a moment to subscribe and tap that like button. If you're drawn to history's darker corners, if you're drawn to the secrets long hidden and truths most would rather erase, then you're exactly where you need to be. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It was July 1545, and all Madrid celebrated. The Habsburg dynasty had secured a son, a continuation of power through bloodlines that had ruled Europe for centuries. Yet this same blood, passed down too many times between cousins and uncles, carried within it the seeds of disaster. The Habsburgs were infamous for their obsession with pure lineage. For generations, they married within their own family, binding cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew. They believed this preserved their royal blood. Instead, it poisoned it. Don Carlos's mother, Maria of Portugal, was both Philip's wife and his close relative. Their marriage was less a union of love and more an experiment in genetic roulette. And the result was catastrophic. Maria died just 4 days after giving birth, leaving the infant motherless. Carlos himself emerged sickly, twisted, and fragile. His head was unusually large, his jaw jutted unnaturally forward, and his spine curved with deformity. He would never grow into the tall, commanding figure of his father. Instead, he would always resemble something closer to a shadow of what a prince was meant to be. From the start, young Carlos was a burden to his caregivers. He suffered constant fevers, seizures, and violent rages. His small frame was forced into iron boots in a desperate attempt to straighten his legs. Physicians prescribed everything from mercury baths to endless bloodletting, draining his body of vitality in the name of healing. None of it worked. If anything, these so-called cures only worsened his condition. Behind palace walls, whispers spread. Servants traded rumors of the cursed prince, saying he was haunted, that the blood of the Habsburgs had turned against them. Philip, a king known for his cold discipline, tried to ignore these murmurs. But even he could not deny what his eyes told him: his son was not like other boys. As Carlos grew older, his deformities became matched by his temper. He lashed out at tutors, smashed objects in fits of rage, and struck servants for the smallest perceived insult. One chilling story tells of a shoemaker summoned to the palace to deliver a pair of custom boots. Carlos, displeased with the fit, ordered the man to eat the shoes he had made. When the craftsman hesitated, the prince forced him at sword point to chew and swallow leather until he nearly choked to death. Another time, Carlos locked a servant in a room with no food or water simply because the man spilled wine at dinner. He seemed fascinated by pain, by control, by the suffering of others. The court watched in horror, powerless to stop him. This was, after all, the heir to the empire. Yet, despite his cruelty, Carlos was not cunning. His mind, though brilliant at flashes of memory and quick wit, was unstable. He grew paranoid, believing that everyone, servants, nobles, even his father, plotted against him. He began carrying knives under his robes, convinced assassins lurked around every corner. Even love turned to torment. When Carlos was still a teenager, he was promised the hand of a French princess, Elizabeth of Valois. For the boy, this was perhaps the one glimmer of hope, a chance at happiness. But fate twisted cruelly. Instead of marrying Carlos, Elizabeth became the bride of his father, King Philip II. The young prince was humiliated, shattered. His father had stolen not only his fiancée but also the last fragile piece of his pride. From that day forward, Carlos's hatred of Philip deepened into something darker than simple resentment. All of this, The deformities, the madness, the cruelty, was the making of the moment when Philip stood armored before his son's bedchamber. The empire could no longer bear the risk. The boy who should have been Spain's future had become its greatest threat. And so, the king chose duty over blood. Philip raised his hand, and the guards surrounded the prince. As torches flared against the chamber walls, Don Carlos screamed, thrashing against his captors, spitting curses at his father. Philip did not flinch. To him, the decision had already been made long ago. The empire would survive. His son would not. And that night, history recorded not just the arrest of a prince, but the sealing of his tragic fate. But how did Don Carlos descend from cursed child to violent tyrant in waiting? What horrors in his youth fueled the darkness that would one day force a king to imprison his own blood? The story of Don Carlos is not one of brilliance dimmed, but of madness sharpened by power. From the moment he could walk, the court whispered of his violent streak. What had begun as childhood tantrums soon evolved into dangerous outbursts that terrified even grown men. By the age of 8, Carlos's deformities were undeniable. His legs were twisted, forcing him to walk with an awkward gait. His chest jutted unnaturally forward, his jaw locked into the infamous Habsburg chin, and his head seemed too large for his frail frame. Doctors tried everything. They strapped heavy iron boots to his legs, hoping to force them straight through sheer weight. They submerged him in mercury baths, claiming the liquid metal would cleanse his blood. They bled him repeatedly with leeches, draining his strength in the name of balance. But nothing could fix him. His body only grew weaker, his temper more unstable. His tutors fared no better. Carlos hated authority and resisted any effort to discipline him. When corrected, he flew into fits of rage, throwing books across the room or striking at his teachers. One account tells of him slamming a heavy inkwell into a tutor's face, splitting the man's lip open, simply because he didn't like the way he had been scolded. But his cruelty extended beyond defiance. Carlos seemed fascinated with suffering. Servants whispered of the boy's games, trapping insects and pulling them apart piece by piece, tormenting small animals in the stables, even threatening to burn cats alive for amusement. The court began to fear him, but no one dared intervene. He was the heir to the most powerful empire in the world. Who would stop him? As he entered his teenage years, Carlos grew even more erratic. He was quick to violence and seemed incapable of empathy. He once chased a servant down the palace corridors with a sword, all because the man had accidentally brushed against his arm. Another time, he locked a kitchen boy in a chest and left him there for hours, laughing at the child's screams. But the most infamous incident was with a poor shoemaker summoned to make him boots. When the craftsman delivered them, Carlos, dissatisfied with the fit, drew his sword and ordered the man to eat them. The terrified shoemaker begged for mercy, but Carlos forced him, slashing at the air until the man choked down leather and thread, nearly suffocating. For Carlos, it wasn't about the boots. It was about control. The prince reveled in reminding everyone, from servants to nobles, that their lives meant nothing compared to his will. Still, there were moments when his sharp memory and flashes of intelligence stunned those around him. He could recall entire passages of Latin texts after a single reading, mimic voices with unnerving precision, and solve riddles faster than his tutors. But brilliance without stability is a dangerous weapon. His paranoia grew alongside his intelligence. By 16, Carlos carried daggers under his robes, convinced assassins lurked behind every door. He accused servants of spying, nobles of treason, and even his own family of plotting against him. He began refusing food for fear it was poisoned, demanding tasters for every meal. Sometimes, in sudden bursts of suspicion, he hurled plates to the floor, convinced the dishes themselves were traps. The boy who should have been the pride of Spain had become a source of dread. And then came the deepest wound of all, betrayal by his own father. As a teenager, Carlos had been promised the hand of Elizabeth of Valois, a radiant French princess whose marriage was meant to secure peace between France and Spain. For the unstable prince, this engagement became an obsession. He spoke endlessly of Elizabeth, confided in his friends about the life they would build, and seemed, for the first time, capable of genuine joy. But when Elizabeth arrived in Spain, fate twisted cruelly. Instead of marrying Carlos, she was given to his father, King Philip II. The court rejoiced at the alliance, but for Carlos it was humiliation of the highest order. His father had not only stolen his bride but also shattered his one fragile dream of happiness. From that day on, Carlos's hatred of Philip hardened into something unshakable. He saw his father not as a king, but as a rival, an enemy who had robbed him of love. His obsession with Elizabeth didn't fade, either. Servants reported him lurking outside her chambers, watching her from the shadows. At dinners, his eyes burned with jealousy as Philip and Elizabeth sat together. He wrote her strange letters, veering between declarations of love and bitter accusations of betrayal. Elizabeth, caught in the nightmare, played the dutiful queen but lived in quiet fear of her unstable stepson. By his late teens, Carlos was unrecognizable as the boy Spain had once celebrated. His body was frail, his mind poisoned by rage, jealousy, and paranoia. Even his closest attendants admitted they dreaded being near him. The prince, one wrote, is consumed by violent passions, and he seems happiest only when others suffer. The empire trembled. This was the heir? This was the man who would one day inherit half the known world? Philip, ever the cold and calculating monarch, began to face an impossible truth. If Carlos became king, he might destroy everything the Habsburgs had built. But just when it seemed Carlos could not sink deeper into instability, fate delivered the blow that would change him forever. A violent accident, a fractured skull, and a medical cure that only fueled his madness. By his late teens, Don Carlos was already infamous in the Spanish court. Twisted in body, violent in spirit, and consumed by jealousy toward his father, he seemed destined for ruin. Yet fate had not finished with him. One winter evening in 1562, while inspecting grain stores at the palace, Carlos attempted to descend a narrow staircase. True to his clumsy gait, his deformed legs tangled beneath him. He stumbled, lost his balance, and tumbled headlong down the stone steps. The impact was catastrophic. His head cracked against the floor with a sound so sickening that attendants swore it echoed in their dreams for weeks. The prince was carried to his chambers, bleeding and unconscious, his skull fractured. For days, he lay hovering between life and death. Priests prepared for last rites, and King Philip himself began drafting orders for succession. Spain braced itself for the death of its heir. But Carlos did not die. Desperate to save him, physicians resorted to a brutal procedure known as trepanation. With crude instruments, they bored holes directly into his skull to relieve the pressure of swelling inside his brain. It was a last resort, a gamble between survival and certain death. To the astonishment of the court, the procedure worked. Carlos stirred, his eyes fluttering open. The palace erupted in celebration, calling it a miracle. Songs were sung, prayers offered, bells rung across Madrid. But the miracle was laced with poison. Though Carlos survived, he did not return the same. His already unstable mind seemed unhinged by the injury. He became more violent, more paranoid, more unpredictable than ever before. He lashed out at anyone who entered his chamber, once hurling a candlestick so hard it shattered against a wall, barely missing a priest. He stopped eating regularly, fearing poison in every dish. He tested servants by demanding they take bites of his food before he touched it. If they hesitated, he accused them of treason. Even Elizabeth of Valois, his stepmother and the woman who had once been promised to him, was not spared. Carlos had never let go of his obsession with her. Before his accident, his longing had been dangerous but restrained. After, it grew feral. He sent her disturbing notes scrawled in the night, letters that veered between desperate pleas of love and furious condemnations of betrayal. He lurked outside her chambers, sometimes pounding on the door in the dead of night, demanding to see her. Elizabeth, barely more than a teenager herself, wept in fear, trapped between duty to her king and terror of his son. Philip, stone-faced as ever, ignored the rumors as long as he could. But whispers of the prince's behavior spread beyond the palace walls. The people began to murmur, Spain's heir was a madman. The court grew tense. Nobles avoided Carlos in corridors, servants fled at his approach. He grew increasingly isolated, locked in a spiral of anger and humiliation. When denied something, he responded with violence. Once, upon being told he could not attend a royal meeting, he smashed an ornate mirror with his fists until his hands dripped with blood. Another time, when a servant refused his demand for more wine, Carlos chased him through the palace with a sword, screaming that he would cut him open like a pig. Even his allies began to desert him. The boy who had once been destined to rule now seemed more like a danger to everyone around him. But Carlos's paranoia had another outlet, politics. Convinced his father was plotting against him, he began forging secret plans of his own. He whispered with discontented nobles, reaching out to enemies of the crown. He dreamed aloud of escaping Spain, of fleeing to the rebellious Netherlands and leading a revolt against his father. He ranted to anyone who would listen that Philip was a tyrant, a usurper, a man unworthy of Elizabeth and unworthy of Spain. He declared he would reclaim what had been stolen from him, both in throne and in love. His behavior grew so reckless that spies had little trouble reporting every detail back to the king. And still, King Philip hesitated. For all his coldness, Philip was not simply a monarch, he was a father. Watching his only son spiral into madness tore at him. He had tolerated much, perhaps too much, clinging to hope that Carlos might change, might grow into his role. But as the evidence mounted, Philip could no longer ignore reality. His son was dangerous, not only to the crown but to the empire itself. Elizabeth, too, became a silent victim of this struggle. She played her role as queen with grace, but behind closed doors she lived in fear. Fear of her stepson's obsession, fear of her husband's wrath should she confide, fear of the entire crumbling future of Spain. For her, the love triangle was not romantic, it was suffocating. And then came the breaking point. Carlos openly discussed fleeing Spain with the Dutch rebels, enemies who were already threatening Philip's empire. He told confidants he would raise an army, return in glory, and overthrow his father. He spoke these things not in whispers, but in open declarations. His madness had stripped him of caution. Philip heard every word. The king's choice was no longer between patience and anger. It was between empire and destruction. Madness unleashed, the walls close in on Don Carlos. His treason becomes undeniable, and his father, torn between blood and duty, finally makes the choice that will seal his son's fate forever. By 1567, Don Carlos had become the most dangerous man in Spain, not because of his strength, but because of his instability. The boy who should have been groomed to inherit half the world had instead become a powder keg of rage, paranoia, and betrayal. Every step he took shook the fragile court of Madrid. Carlos no longer hid his treasonous dreams. He spoke openly of fleeing Spain and joining forces with the Dutch rebels, those same rebels who were bleeding Philip's empire dry in the Low Countries. At court dinners, he would sneer across the table at his father and boast of how easily he could raise an army to depose him. To some nobles, he whispered promises of wealth and power if they joined his cause. He even attempted to sell off crown jewels to fund his imagined escape, pawning priceless heirlooms in secret. The king's spies had little work to do. Carlos was reckless enough to expose himself without much effort. Reports flowed to Philip daily. His son was plotting rebellion, conspiring with enemies, and fantasizing about murdering his father. In the palace, Elizabeth of Valois lived as a prisoner of circumstance. The young queen, married to a man twice her age, endured the shadow of her stepson's obsession. Carlos still hovered outside her chambers at night, muttering her name, pounding on her doors. Servants described her trembling hands as she begged them never to leave her alone. The love story that playwrights would later romanticize was, in truth, a nightmare of harassment and unwanted advances. Elizabeth's life was marked by a daily terror, that the deranged heir might force his way into her room or that Philip would punish her for provoking his jealousy. The Spanish court was paralyzed. Nobles and servants alike feared both Carlos's wrath and Philip's silence. On one hand, they saw the prince spiraling into lunacy, throwing dishes at feasts, threatening guards, chasing courtiers with daggers. On the other hand, they knew he was still heir to the empire. To oppose him was treason. To support him was suicide. The palace became a cage of whispers and paranoia. Everyone waited for Philip to act. Philip II was not a man easily shaken. Known as the prudent king, he ruled with cold calculation, his mind always on the preservation of his empire. Yet here, his most difficult challenge was not a foreign enemy, but his own flesh and blood. To imprison his son meant dishonoring the dynasty. To ignore him meant risking rebellion and ruin. For months, Philip wrestled with the decision in silence. He prayed, consulted advisors, and read report after report of Carlos's increasingly erratic behavior. Still, he hesitated. Perhaps a part of him clung to the faint hope that his son might recover. But hope could not outweigh reality. In late January of 1568, Philip received word that Carlos had taken his plotting further. He had attempted to ally himself directly with Spain's enemies. He intended to flee Madrid and lead an armed rebellion against his own father. This was no longer the tantrum of a spoiled prince. This was treason. Philip's choice was made. On the night of January 18, 1568, the king donned full battle armor. He summoned guards, armed and ready, as though preparing to storm a fortress. The procession marched through the palace, their boots echoing against the stone floors. Finally, they reached the chamber of Don Carlos. Philip did not send a captain or minister. He went himself. With a thunderous crash, he threw open the door. The sight that greeted him was pitiful, his son, disheveled, wild-eyed, pacing like a caged animal. Carlos lunged for a weapon, but the guards were faster. They pinned him down as he screamed curses at his father. Philip stood over him, silent and immovable. His face betrayed nothing, no sorrow, no pity, only the cold mask of a king who had chosen empire over blood. That night, Don Carlos was locked away, a prisoner not of war but of his own father. Imprisonment did not calm him. Instead, Carlos deteriorated rapidly. He refused food for days, then demanded banquets and stuffed himself until he vomited. He stripped off his clothes and raved at guards, smashing furniture against the walls. He grew obsessed with ice, demanding chunks of it to chew even in the dead of winter. Some say he believed the cold would burn away poison. His once frail body was wasted further. His eyes sank, his skin yellowed, and his teeth rotted. Within months, he was a walking skeleton, consumed by paranoia and madness. The king never spoke of his decision. He told the court only that his son was unwell and being treated. Behind closed doors, he ordered Carlos's name erased from documents, his existence quietly buried in silence. The empire marched on, but within the palace walls, a prince was rotting away, unseen and forgotten. And so, Don Carlos, the heir to Spain, the boy born to rule half the world, became a prisoner in his own palace. But his story does not end with his arrest. Within 6 months, he would be dead at just 23 years old, his final days shrouded in mystery, his legacy twisted by history and legend alike. Was Don Carlos truly insane, or was he simply a victim of a dynasty's corruption, crushed by a father who feared him? The cold January night of 1568 marked the beginning of the end for Don Carlos. His arrest shocked the Spanish court, but the true horror was what came after. Locked away in the palace under heavy guard, the 22-year-old heir to the greatest empire on earth wasted away. At first, he fought his imprisonment with wild fury. He hurled curses at his guards, screamed until his voice cracked, and demanded release. But as the days passed, his energy drained. His body grew weaker, his mind more chaotic. Carlos was confined to a small suite of rooms, barred windows keeping him from the outside world. Guards were posted at every entrance, instructed never to let him leave. His meals were carefully monitored, but Carlos distrusted them all. Convinced he was being poisoned, he sometimes refused food for days, leaving trays untouched until they rotted. Other times, in frenzied hunger, he devoured everything set before him, only to vomit it up in terror. He stripped himself naked, pacing his chambers like a trapped beast. He smashed chairs against the walls, shredded bedding with his teeth, and scrawled nonsense on the walls with whatever he could find. Perhaps the strangest obsession was his demand for ice. Even in winter, he insisted that great blocks of it be brought to him. He chewed it endlessly, lips blue, teeth chattering, convinced the cold would burn away toxins hidden in his food. What the guards witnessed was not the life of a prince, it was the slow unraveling of a man consumed by madness. And what of his father? King Philip II did not visit his son. He did not speak of him. When courtiers asked, Philip dismissed them coldly, "The prince is unwell." In private, Philip kept records, noting Carlos's decline as if he were cataloguing the death of a soldier, not a son. He showed no outward grief, no hesitation, no regret. To the king, duty came before blood. And if that meant sacrificing his own heir, so be it. But historians have long debated, was this calculation, or was it cruelty? Did Philip destroy a madman for the sake of Spain, or did he murder his son to protect his throne? By June of 1568, Carlos was skeletal. He could barely stand. His once bright eyes had dulled, his body ravaged by starvation, paranoia, and confinement. On July 24th, he collapsed into bed. For 6 days, he drifted between feverish dreams and fits of agony. His attendants reported violent convulsions, sweats, and shivering. He cried out for water, then for ice, then for death. Finally, on July 29th, at just 23 years old, Don Carlos died. The official record claimed he passed peacefully in his sleep. But witnesses told another story, of violent thrashing, of poison, of slow suffocation. To this day, historians cannot agree. Was his death natural, the result of neglect and madness? Or was it an execution carried out quietly, ordered by a father who could no longer risk his son's existence? What Philip did next was perhaps even darker. He ordered that Carlos's name be erased from official documents. Portraits of him were hidden away, mentions and chronicles minimized. The once celebrated heir was to be forgotten, buried not only in the ground but in history itself. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning. Spain moved on as if Carlos had never lived. For Philip, it was the ultimate act of control. He had removed a threat not only from his empire, but from memory itself. Yet history has a way of resurrecting the forgotten. Centuries later, writers, poets, and composers rediscovered Don Carlos's story and transformed it. No longer the cruel, paranoid boy who tortured servants and plotted treason, Carlos became a tragic figure in their hands, a romantic hero, imprisoned for love, destroyed by a tyrannical father. Friedrich Schiller wrote of him in his famous play Don Carlos. Giuseppe Verdi turned his story into an opera, filling stages with the lament of a doomed prince and his forbidden love for Elizabeth of Valois. In art, he became not the monster described by Cortes, but a martyr of passion and freedom, the prince who dared to defy a king. It was a myth, of course. But myths often outlast the truth. And so, Don Carlos lives on today, not as he was, but as the world wanted him to be. His cruelty, his paranoia, his madness, all forgotten. His longing for Elizabeth, his rebellion against Philip, his tragic end, those became legend. The boy erased by his father was reborn as a symbol of love and defiance. It is the greatest irony of all, that Philip II, the man who tried to bury his son's memory, only ensured he would be immortalized. But the question lingers. Who was Don Carlos really? Was he the insane, deformed prince, a victim of inbreeding and neglect, doomed before he was even born? Or was he a young man crushed under the weight of a merciless dynasty, punished for daring to resist a king who valued empire more than blood? The answer lies somewhere in between, blurred by centuries of propaganda, rumor, and art. But one truth is clear, his story, whether of madness or martyrdom, still captures us today. And now, after 5 centuries, his shadow still lingers. Think about it, a prince born cursed, feared by his people, betrayed by his father, and erased from history, only to be remembered forever in legend.